Okay, it's time for episode 2 of our Canon series on The Oldest Nerd. Hello out there, I am The Oldest Nerd, and last time we were talking about the types of canon there was in Star Trek, and we talked about Gene Roddenberry's take on it, which, as we said, was not always absolutely consistent. He tended to change his mind from time to time as to what was canonical and what wasn't. And after he died, it was a difficulty to figure out what Gene would have wanted, even by people who worked closely with him, like Doug Berman did, and people like Michael Okuda and Rick Sternbach, who became kind of the archivist of Canon, were often not absolutely sure what Gene wanted. But let's talk first about the non-canonical works like the novels. For a long time, pocketbooks were doing novelizations of individual programs. You could buy them that had enhanced versions of the episodes of the original series. And these are all considered to be kind of like the Star Wars extended universe. It's a nice thing to be able to read up on between series or between movies and things like this, but not expected to be something that you would base your life on as being part of the official canon of the series. So, in fact, Roddenberry went as far as to say the novels and the comic books have nothing to do with the series. They're allowed, they're fun, but they are not official. So, still, a lot was used from them. For instance, James T. Kirk. They never said during the original series what the T stood for, but in the animated series, they decided that the T stood for Tiberius. This was in one of the episodes of the animated series, and even though the animated series was, according to Roddenberry, not canon, they used the name in two of the movies. In Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, they called him James Tiberius Kirk. In the reboot Star Trek movie, they called young Jim Kirk James Tiberius Kirk. So this is now canonical because of the point that is taken from what Roddenberry considered non-canonical, put into a canonical work. Is that simple enough? At any rate, that's Tiberius Sulu, for instance. Hikaru Sulu and Nyota Uhura came from the same Star Trek novel. This was The Entropy Effect, which was a book that gave both of those characters first names. Hikaru was used later in the film series, and then Uhura's first name was not used until the reboot Star Trek, the Kelvin Universe Star Trek, in which Spock called her Nyota, despite the fact that Kirk could not get her first name out of her through the whole first part of the picture. There is something to be said about Sulu's name as well. Roddenberry, upon being asked about where the name Sulu came from, because it's not really a Japanese sounding name, he claimed that it came from the Sulu Island in the Philippines. And that was taken at face value until Herb Solo's book came out, in which he was talking about the relationship that Solo and Roddenberry had, that Sulu was actually just a corruption of Solo because of the high regard that Gene Roddenberry had for Herb Solo, who was running Desilu Studios at the time that Star Trek was in its first production. And that's reinforced by the fact that in the end credits in the early Desilu original series, the last title card showed an alien, which was used in one of the first season episodes as a stand-in for Clint Howard, who was not a very imposing looking alien, and he had a false front, which was this melted face looking alien. And they always put that up when it put Herb Solo. They did that as a tribute to Herb Solo. So there was a lot of admiration between Roddenberry and Solo. Anyway, Other things that we need to touch upon that are also non-canonical are things that we were never expected to see. In the next generation, the computer displays and the button labels and all this kind of stuff were supposed to be in the background far enough to where on a regular television you could not make them out. They weren't anticipating high definition television, and since these shows were shot in 35 millimeter film, the film was a whole lot more clear than TV pictures were. And when they converted these shows to high definition, suddenly you're able to read the computer displays and some of the buttons. And you'll find that a lot of what's on there were jokes by the production staff. For instance, there was a lot of anime references in labels on the buttons and on the computer screens. The engines were YPS engine, Yoyodyne propulsion systems, which is from The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai, which was a favored film of a number of people on the Star Trek staff. So they're considered non-canonical, even though in freeze frame and in high definition, you can actually read some of the biographies and things like this. These were things that were just put in that were supposed to be background and are considered non-canonical. In films, we're not quite sure where to go there because obviously the films would be considered canon, even though that Roddenberry never gave us a good idea of what he thought was canon and what wasn't. He, in fact, did not like one of the ways that Savick was used, even though he never created that character. Anyway, in the case of films, we find that the theatrical versions, of course, are canon. We're considering the director's cut is also canon. These are things that were put out there, they were sold, and it's kind of iffy of the special features. The outtakes and things like that that have been put on DVD releases are not necessarily canon. Although things like in the first Star Trek the Motion Picture, the Peter Preston, the engineer's mate, was in a cut scene explained to be Scotty's nephew. Now that was put back in the director's cut, so that's canonical. But other things that have been included and disincluded in the picture may not be. So there was a cut scene, for instance, in the second Star Trek where Spock makes some reference to his encounter with V'ger in the first film, and that was cut out of the second film and is considered not part of the canon. So it's a little bit iffy on a number of these things and subject to debate. Now, novels and games and comics, according to Gene Roddenberry, are not canon, and yet they have been used as resources by writers. And in the next video, we're going to talk about some things that were not canon that were used as resources. Some of them were intended to be resources, some of them were intended not to be. And we'll talk about that in part 3. Until then, don't forget to subscribe, make some comments if you wish, and let me know what you think about what's been said so far, and stay tuned for the next video. Don't go far.